My name is Will Scott. I'm going to kick off the libp2p privacy track this afternoon. This is a intro and vision talk around libp2p privacy. I'll start with a brief introduction of myself. My name's Will. Recently, I've been working mostly on content routing and a little bit in data transfer. So there's sort of core layers of what it means to be a peer-to-peer network in some ways. And then in my 20% time, I guess, I've also been helping think about how to push our privacy story forward. And so this summer, we spun up at Blue Fund. And so there was a bunch of talks over the last few days around funding the commons and around what PL means when it talks about Blue Funds. But essentially, there's a funding program that came into existence over the last few months where we're offering money for external prototyping and projects that want to think about privacy for content address data and for peer-to-peer networks in ways that can lead to us having a better story. So this is a fairly brief talk, but I want to cover three things. The first, and sort of what I'll spend most of the time on, is what do we mean when we talk about a private peer-to-peer network? What is it that what are these North Stars, or what is this like direction we're heading? I'll talk a little bit about tactics to get there, and then I'll finish with just a bit of logistical things in terms of what is the schedule for the rest of this afternoon. Okay, so let's talk about what we mean, or what we could imagine when we're talking about privacy in a peer-to-peer context. There's a few different layers of privacy, right? I'll start at the bottom, which is you could just encrypt your messages, right? That's better than not encrypting your messages. That gives you a layer of privacy. That limits who else can see what you've said, because you've taken the other person's identity, maybe you've exchanged that out of band somehow, you encrypt and you limit who can see the actual conversation. We're pretty good. We've got end-to-end encryption as a thing that's like pretty pervasive in a lot of our messaging protocols. That one's covered. There's a set of things around the communication patterns, and so this metadata question, that's really the heart of the hard part, right? So can I understand communication patterns of who is talking to whom, or additional access patterns, maybe the size of the messages. There's just a lot of things that leak beyond just the direct encryption, and that's sort of the heart of what we end up talking about and wrestling with, is how to make that set of leakages minimized. There's a final part at the top, which is, are you participating in this network or not? I think libp2p is actually like this really interesting answer to that top level question, in that it's pretty easy to identify that you are a libp2p node, but it's harder to distinguish which libp2p network you are participating in. And so by having, well, I'm just a libp2p participant, that's a lot less scary to people than, oh, I'm a Tor user or something, right? And so by making these general peer-to-peer network protocols like HTTP, you can gain enough adoption at the top level that you've got the space to protect more sensitive communications. Okay, so if we focus on sort of this middle bit of being able to protect your actual access patterns and what that means in peer-to-peer, you've got a whole set of techniques again. And a lot of these, there's a core trade-off in overhead and sort of these like, well, you know, what is the like set that I'm going to be able to hide in? And as I make that set bigger, I end up having to do more work or be less efficient. One way that you can make that trade-off is at a network traffic level. So I can either use techniques like mixnets, so think Tor, or a full mixnet like NIM or something, where I send my traffic and indirect it through a few other network hops in order to have it become sort of mixed with other traffic that's flowing through the network. And so I trade off latency, and I trade off the fact that I'm going through multiple computers instead of directly. That's going to take longer. I'm going to pay for that bandwidth as a longer path that's more expensive. But I'm growing this set of other messages that mine could potentially be confused with. There's another set of things that use cover traffic instead. And so instead of thinking about it as, well, I'm going to like go through this long path, it's that, well, I'm going to send out my message, but I'm also going to send out a lot of other decoy messages that don't actually contain the real thing I care about. And so it'll be harder for someone to know which one is the real message, because I've also have a network that's sending a lot of sort of fake data that looks like it might be a message, but that obscures the real communication patterns in it. I think Vuvuzela is a paper you can look at, and Stadium and so forth. There's a line of work on models for cover traffic to hide your communication patterns. The other overhead that we could think about is starting at a cryptographic computational level. And so you've got a set of cryptographic primitives, like zero knowledge, fully homomorphic encryption, private information retrieval, where you're trading off a computational overhead in exchange for having a direct server that's getting a query from being able to fully understand what that query is asking. And these are just a few examples. There's other techniques that play into this. There's things like ORAM. There's a lot of cryptographic work in this space. And a lot of where that is trying to figure out how do you get that to scale up to the sizes of networks that we're looking at in practice. So things like homomorphic encryption are taking maybe hundreds of milliseconds or seconds to answer a simple query. And so is that a latency bound that you're willing to pay to evaluate a circuit or do these various things? Private information retrieval is as practical as any of these, I think. And what it limits is, well, there's a couple different formulations, but the one that's maybe the one that's very satisfying, it's not necessarily the most practical, ends up doing a very expensive read every time there's a query. If you can keep your database that you're making this set of anonymity fully in memory, you can actually amortize this down to a level where you can make a pretty practical server. But you have to figure out then your broader system question to be able to talk about, okay, how do I have each node in my peer-to-peer network, when it gets a query, what is the right set of 10 gigs? Like you've got some memory size that you're willing to have as that memory footprint, and that becomes your anonymity set, and so you have to choose that somewhat carefully. And you have to know ahead of time what that memory looks like to some extent. Okay, so there's a few different ways to talk about privacy. Probably the most useful one in this context of a peer-to-peer network is linkability, which is, can I link the action and the effect in the network with the person creating it? So can I say, okay, there was some end recipient of a message, can I link that back? And so you're looking, you can express this in a statistical way and talk about, given an adversary's view, as the view changes, how much of the network overall traffic can they link? There's a few different ways that you would construct this, but the end property that you end up often wanting to be able to describe is this de-anonymizing potential of different levels of an adversary. And the core thing that we end up staring at is that as you're trying to convolve with a large anonymity set, you have to get all of that stuff to potentially be in the same place. And that ends up being this inefficient thing, because if you're actually a decentralized peer-to-peer network, you don't want all of your traffic to go to some choke point. And so if you're staying out on the edges, how is there the potential that it's some other faraway effect that could be misrepresented as the one that I'm doing? And so you end up with a smaller anonymity set through that decentralization. The flip side that our adversary models don't do a great job of is taking into account the physical realities of the world, I guess, which is that when you think about what is the adversary, what does it mean for the adversary to be able to monitor stuff? We often talk about a few different things. One is you've compromised some subset of the hosts, right? So if I've got my malware on some nodes, that is an adversary model that is really the same if I've got a centralized service or if I've got a decentralized or a peer-to-peer service. But we also talk about sort of like, oh, but what if the nation state is able to monitor all the traffic in their administrative region, or what has some broad view of the network. But the interesting thing there is when you look at what nation states have built for their surveillance systems to monitor the traffic going through their systems, it's pretty cheap for them to put those monitoring systems at the big internet exchange points in the big cities where the undersea cables show up at their borders. Being able to monitor all of the edge traffic, so if I was to send traffic to some other user on the same ISP in Lisbon, in the same city, that's maybe getting to the metro POP, the point of presence of this local ISP. But it may even be getting even sub-regional, depending on how they're doing their load traffic. And so getting full monitoring of these very sub-regional, hyper-local communication lines is actually much more expensive to build a surveillance infrastructure over the whole thing. And that's something we should be trying to take advantage of, and thinking about the fact that if you're able to make communications, certainly on your LAN, but really within the same ISP or AS level topologies, you should think of those as harder to monitor in some sense by a global adversary. You have to be able to separate your adversary model and talk about this, nation state / global adversary defenses and how you're going to defend against that separately from malware-like things. But there's a set where we can actually make use of the network topology and our peer-to-peer network to do better. And then finally, I think the thing that we should remember with libp2p, especially as a modular toolkit, is that one size is not going to fit all. So at a libp2p level, let's have building blocks so that people can build applications that work for their network. And so it's not, we're going to have the private libp2p, here it is. It's, well, okay, do you want to have onions to connect to each other and have a thing that's fully private? Or do you want to allow some users to connect in without revealing themselves? Or do you want to allow some people to post privately? There's a whole different realm, like a whole different range of communication patterns that people might want to do on a lib peer-to-peer based network. And we can provide building blocks to allow them to compose that. I think we often get scared of what happens if someone leaks something or doesn't compose them correctly. And so we should think about guides to help steer people in good compositions that we think will not leak things, and also have the, what are the things to remember or watch out for? Okay, if you also just put all of your addresses in a central database, it doesn't matter that you've, made a Tor transport. So there are a set of things that we should, have a way for people to audit to make sure they've actually done the thing they want. But it's not our place to say, this is the right network. Okay, I'll cover briefly tactics. I think there's a few different things in the libp2p ecosystem that we've thought about, that we'll hear about over the course of today. The first is some direct building things. There's a bunch of active work on taking, especially the content routing subset of the libp2p problem, so figuring out who has content, and adding a level of derived hashes or blinded hashes, such that you can't immediately understand what other people in the network want that's getting implemented. Beyond that, there's a bunch of stuff in the ecosystem and collaborations that we're doing that are making us stronger and letting us experiment with this broader range of privacy options. I've lifted some pictures on the slide, but there's many more. And then finally, we're trying to increase the community and the focus on this problem at a broader level, primarily through funding efforts. And so that's taking people who aren't already in libp2p but are working on problems that are useful to us and making sure that they understand our problems from peer-to-peer and from content addressing as a core primitive that we have, and helping address that.